we put this stuff up on the website. So, okay, so idealism and realism. Okay, so we have idealism on this side and realism. And one of my questions for Professor G and Thomas is whether these terms are really being applied in the Western sense. So that's kind of a hanging question. In terms of idealism, you have the Buddhist portrait. This is all Yoga Sutra, just to be clear, okay? The sutras that I'm mostly looking at are 141, 222, and 412 through 22. This is where we start talking about modes of perceptions, Buddhist refutation, what is the nature of consciousness. It's all very interesting. There's a theory that the fourth chapter of the Yoga Sutra, I don't know how credible it is, was a later addition, and it certainly reads that way because sutra after sutra after sutra seems to be refuting the Buddhist position in a very systematic sort of way. Some of the language used for liberation and for other things is a little bit different there. So it kind of reads in that. So it's really neat that there's this like section of about 10 sutras that just is taken on the Buddhists to task. Okay, so that's kind of where we're going. But the idealism here, we have the Buddhist Purvapaksha. They're considered by Bryant to be idealism, right? And then also Burley. This is his reading of the Yoga Sutra, okay? So what's interesting here, and then Bryant is Bryant and like the traditional commentaries and secondary scholarship and the kind of the mainstream way of understanding the Yoga Sutra is that of realism, okay? I'll define the terms in just a second. But what's interesting here is that you have on this philosophical school both a Buddhist and a Yoga Sutra interpretation that both purport to be idealist. So what I think would happen here is I would think that Bryant, I imagine myself in a room with these two guys discussing, their particular views, but I think that Bryant would accuse Burley of being a little too Buddhist in his perception of the Yoga Sutra, okay? So I'm going to get into some of the specifics of this by starting with Tom. I was thinking about calling you guys Tom A and Tom B, but then I didn't want like one of you guys to be like, why am I Tom B? So starting with Tom R, model of Yoga Samkhya. This is a simplified model of what's called the 23 or the 25 principles of Samkhya. This is one of the things that Larson printed in his book on Samkhya. That was it's like in the 60s, right? He came up with this model, this picture that then Bryant puts in his book. So as we saw with Thomas R's, we have the Purusha here, spirit or consciousness, however you want to call it. And then everything below this line is going to be Prakriti, right? And then the basic psychology of this, again, this is really simplified, but we have like the Buddhi. This is maybe intelligence. Manas, that's like mind, thinking of like the low mind. And then we have something to the effect here where we have Vishaya, which is the external sense objects.
Mahat?
And then you have the Mahat and the Hamkara up in here as well too. Mahat is usually used for this. But we can think of like the Hamkara / Asmita as being right here, So everything here is kind of Parinamaikatvat vastu tattvam, right? It's this idea that it's this ekatva, this singular substance of prakriti that just goes through parinama. It permutates, and it changes. And in the process, it individuates and gives us what we kind of think of as our, general terms of our psychology, right? With this higher mind, lower mind, and then the sense objects, okay? So again, this is a real simplification. We can maybe put indriyas here, senses, right? And then kind of equivalent to that is what we would call tan matras. That's like seeing, hearing, tasting, etc. And then Vishayas here, we might call that as being somewhat equivalent to the Mahabhutas.
Objects of senses.
Yeah, the Bhutas, the Vishayas, the objects, right? Sense objects. This is just kind of a little more specific way of talking about these things.
Do you see, by the way, any kind of evolutionary flow? Some people will say, if you had Mahat there, then that's the first concrete evolute, right? So it's all, everything is one.
Mm-hmm.
There's Ekatva there too, but everything is still one, but ready to break up and evolve into all the other different parts. So the second stage is the intelligence. That's the first evolute, or the second evolute rather than the mind, the third evolute, and then the things breaking up.
Yeah.
So there's a kind of a
It's a movement from quality to quantity, right?
Yes.
It starts with a singular quantity or quality,
Right.
and then it moves to multiple quantity. There's a couple terms that we need to discuss here as well too. Stula and Shukshma, whereas down here this is gross. This is kind of like this stuff, and then as you go up this way, you get Shukshma, subtle. And then over on this side, we have kind of what Professor G, if I'm understanding correctly, is talking about as Vyakta Avyakta.
you might define those terms.
Yeah, well this is going to be interesting how these are. So one of the things, the reason I'm writing these is because it'll get really contentious between Burley and Bryant how these terms should be understood. But this is like manifest. Oh, sorry, that should be in reverse. Unmanifest. Sorry, no diacritics, takes too much time.
So that's fine.
Okay,
Yeah.
and then this is,
Can you write
sorry,
about
unmanifest.
Avyakta? No, this is Vyakta, right?
Yeah, avyakta, yakta.
Vyakta.
And then this is manifest. Okay? And so, and then the other point of contention, so this is the model, right? Okay, so this is all in here. How to understand it becomes a very, very, very contentious thing between Bryant and Burley, okay? The way that this is traditionally understood, and by traditional I mean pretty much everybody but Burley as far as I can tell, is that it's binary, right? That this is both psychological and this interesting word, cosmogonic. I'm going to go with cosmic, okay, because I'm not really sure what that means, but ontology might be a better way.
No, cosmogonic means what the way the universe comes about.
Okay, yeah, it's the way it's generated, right? We can go with ontology, it's a little bit more broad, but so this is understood as like almost a creation myth, okay? And as a creation myth, we have evolution. Evolution is a diachronic process. That means it starts here and it works its way over to here. So if we're going to think about this as cosmogonic or ontological, in the beginning, to employ the words of the Bible, there was Prakriti and Purusha. Prakriti matter was avyakta, and then it comes into contact with Purusha. Purusha has an animating effect on the three gunas, right? Rajas, Tamas, Sattva. These are the qualities: stagnation, activity, and goodness, or something to that effect. And that's everything that we have is, and Prakriti is of the nature of these three gunas, these three qualities. And it becomes animated, and it produces everything that we see. And that's what the world is made out of, is that, okay? Now, the interesting thing is that what Burley points out is that particular dimension, according to Burley, is not, he says, quote, not even mentioned in the Yoga Sutra. And this is one of the things that I'm going to, well, I guess I can say it right now, but I have a hard time with that because there's so much karma theory in the Yoga Sutra, and for me it's really hard to think about karmic theory apart from ontology. And I think it can be ambiguous. I mean, suppose if you want to interpret it as such, but it's very hard for me to think about karmic theory, first of all, being divorced from transmigration, right? I mean, because they're kind of part of the same package. As a matter of fact, a lot of modern scholars will critique people who use the term karma in like colloquial way is not recognizing its close association with transmigration theory. And once you have transmigration theory, it's very, very, very hard to think about that in a way that's not ontological, okay? So Burley says that this ontological stuff is not even mentioned in this sutra, and that's, I'm assuming, meaning that he's taking karma theory to be not ontological, but to be only phenomenological. So maybe I can take this opportunity to find these terms a little bit more. What Burley says is he has a couple different ways of talking about idealism, right? One of them I recognize as Kantian, and the other one, the only thing I've come across is some writings I've read with Galen Strawson. I'm sure you guys know the source of this stuff a little bit better than I. But really, idealism in the... So Burley sees himself as reading this in a Kantian way, all right? So first of all, he's going to scratch out the ontology, It's not in this sutra. This is simply about our field of experience. He interprets these factors as being the necessary factors for experience, right? And it doesn't happen diachronically. It's not like in the beginning was this, then evolved like this. He believes that synchronically, all of these items are happening all at once. And when we're going through our process of meditation, our self-realization, our kaivalya, it's not that you're completely obliterating this. It's just that you're more like residing in here instead of out here. It's like a shift in your perception in some senses, right? So he sees this as being something that's happening all at once, as opposed to the traditional view of yogas chitta vritti nirodha, your cessation of the churning of the mind, means that you are literally nashtam, you know? You're literally stopping or even destroying prakriti, which is the word that's used in the sutra in 222, right? Right, which is something I'm going to get to. Okay, so what he sees
with a phenomenological approach.
So he's taken pure phenomenology.
Yeah.
What he's saying is that the Yoga Sutra has nothing to say about reality that's outside of our perception. It does not posit whether objects are real at all in and of themselves, in Kantian terms, and that all we can know is our own field of perception, and anything beyond that, the Yoga Sutra is just simply not interested in.
So Purusha is also another part of perception or experience?
Purusha is pure subjectivity with no other factors.
No intentionality.
It's just simply subjectivity.
And,
right?
and it can be experienced according to Burley.
Yeah, now we'll also note that both authors are, and commentators will often point out that really kaivalya is not really described all that well. What happens afterwards, what kaivalya is, it's not really clearly articulated what your relationship is to God. A lot of these things are not articulated.
I don't
Free
know if
will.
there's even God there.
Well, there's God. Yeah, Ishwarda Pranidhana, right? Ishwarda is klesha karma vipaka sayarda paramrsta pradusha vishesha
There's a
Ishwarda.
lot of interpretation of that too, especially for Burley.
Well, you can't interpret the term Ishwarda. I mean, Ishwarda.
Well, how does he interpret Ishwarda?
Burley? That's an interesting question. I'm not really sure. I know how Bryant does, but I'm not.
I can understand Bryant.
Yeah.
Where he comes from.
What's that?
Because of his other background,
Yeah.
the traditions he comes from. But
Yeah.
Burley would be more likely to say, as most yoga scholars are, that what Ishvara stands for there is an exemplary being, another yogi who's attained this state.
Well, with the exception that is Ishwarda being aparamrishta without being touched by klesha, karma, vipaka, and ashaya.
Well,
So
the
thing with
not touched.
Well, you can't really aspire to be God in the same sense because God never was
You don't
involved
have to
in
aspire to be God. You aspire
sorry.
to be the spirit, the Purusha, without being touched by Prakriti.
Yeah, I agree.
So that's just pure state of Kaivalya.
Yeah.
So Ishvara is someone who has attained that.
Because Ishwarda is, after all, Pradusha Vishesha. He's a type of Pradusha just like us. And so in a sense...
He's not another person. He's another exemplary. He's what we will be if we become that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right.
Which then explains why Ishwarda is a valuable object of meditation. Right? Because that's what Ishwarda...
Well, it can be just something that you project yourself towards.
Mm-hmm.
So you be yourself, you're projecting.
Well, towards in the sense that maybe...
So, I think if you're going to be totally faithful to Burley, then you should say that Burley's interpretation of Ishvara would not entail any ontology at all. There would be no ontological attribution to Ishvara. You'd have to completely de-ontologize Ishvara as well. And then you'd have to find a different explanation for what that Ishvara is, or the reference to that is. And you'd have to say, well, given that this whole ontology, which is much, much more, this whole schema is the central metaphysics. And if you're not giving any ontology to that, why worry about one stray reference to Ishvara that happens in there? Making it, that's a kind of a biblical approach to things that, everything else in the Bible might fall apart at some point at the deconstruction, right? You look at some of the feminists and so on, who completely dismiss everything in Bible. But somebody comes along and say, but you can't destroy God. You've got to keep God going.
The non-negotiable.
Right, the non-negotiable entity, And you don't want to get into that kind of a trap.
Yeah.
So even though there is Ishvara mentioned,
Yeah.
it sounds like it's a Bhagavata Ishvara.
Yeah.
And in fact,
He would have to
most
have
of the-
some
most of the
non-ontological.
commentators have also said that, the guy just happened to say this because, the term was around somewhere, Ishvara, and he thought, well, let's whack it in, but don't re-ontologize
Yeah.
just because of that.
Yeah.
Because then, why would you sacrifice this entire beautiful metaphysics and say there is no ontology, there is no being associated, it's all experience, and then you take, Ishvara somewhere along the line, and you try and make it into a real thing. You become a realist then.
Yeah.
You're no longer an idealist. To be an idealist, and Husserl's God, by the way, and Mohanty has written on this, Husserl's reference to God is entirely idealist. It still remains within idealism. It never strays into a real God of the Bible or the Bhagavata or anything like that at all. His God is again the possibility of transcendental subjectivity, transcendental consciousness standing out from this world altogether. Then he dismisses it.
Yeah.
He says it's not possible. So, he erases that God.
That might be how Burley understands it. To be honest, I don't believe that Burley talks about Ishvara in that one book that I read.
He doesn't because
but it's also interesting to know.
A lot of people said
Yeah.
it was a peripheral.
Well, and he also didn't cite a lot of sutras, to be honest. I mean, I think that. Well, we're going to see with some of the sutras I'm going to get in. It's going to be very, very hard to see how Burley's going to explain away the realism in that.
Oh, I think
So-
I know. I think he's going to explain the way a lot of the people have, which is basically to say that it's an exemplary projected being, a exemplary projected state that you would arrive at
Being beyond
when
karma.
you attain the realization of your being Purusha
Yes,
and
yes,
nothing else.
Yes, yes. Yeah, I think that's good. Okay, so anyway, so Burley has this two-way way of looking at idealism, and one is like the Kantian way of phenomenology. You can't know anything outside of your own experience, right? I'm just going to go with Kantian, right? And then his other way of understanding it is, I don't know how this is related to that understanding of idealism, but he certainly fluctuates between these two definitions of idealism seamlessly as if they're one and the same. And I'm not exactly clear on that is, but that is that everything is operating within the field of consciousness, and that you can't have reality apart from consciousness. And to somehow propose a realist idea of reality, so objects being real apart from consciousness, is false because it's a unified field, right?
I think
So-
that's Tom C's idealism.
Okay. Yeah. All right. So I'm
That's
gonna
yoga.
call this like unified field.
That's
or
Yoga
something.
Sutra.
Okay. Yeah.
That's Yoga Sutra.
Okay. So these are the two ways he
And
understands.
Bishop Berkeley.
Who?
Bishop Berkeley,
Berkeley.
after whom the university across the road is named.
Oh.
They pronounce it as Berkeley.
Okay. So then,
Bishop Berkeley.
so this is
Relatives
how
are still
Burley.
around. They come sometimes.
Oh, wow.
And it is Barclay? That's
Yes, Bishop Berkeley.
How did it end up being
Scottish,
Berkeley?
Scottish.
Well, that's interesting.
Scottish. His relatives live in Australia. And the 100th birthday, they all came. I'm sorry, this is distracting.
Oh yeah. Okay. So anyway, the way so this is idealism, right? Is that there's like a field, and you can't know anything that's outside of our field of perception. The other one is that consciousness is somehow inherent, essential to the universe. The way Galen Strawson says it is that it makes more sense for consciousness to be part of evolution instead of being an evolute of the evolutionary process. It doesn't make any sense for matter to bump into itself enough times till suddenly consciousness makes sense or comes out of that. That's like trying to plant an apple tree and get oranges, right? You can't get dumb matter to turn into smart consciousness or perceptible subjective consciousness. You just can't do that, right? So he understands in these two ways.
That's called process philosophy.
Process philosophy.
In process philosophy, everything is evolving all together, all at once, interdependently. Nothing is a product of anything.
Nice. Okay, and then the realism is that actually objects can exist independent and apart. If nobody's there to hear the tree fall, I'm not sure if I'm using that right, but things are real independent of our consciousness, apart from our consciousness, right? And based on this, you kind of have I want to call it like a more optimistic appraisal of reality, and that is that like you can actually perceive reality. As in here, it's almost pessimistic that like you can never know anything beyond your own mind and experience. So you kind of like give up in a sense. Maybe you don't, but in this sense, you can actually know. And so we see this with the first model of perception that happens in the Yoga Sutra is 141, right? Kshina vritirra vijata siva manera grahitira grahano grahyeshu tatstatadan janata samapati, right? For one person whose chitta vritti, the churning of the mind, has stopped, kshina, is attenuated, they become, the analogy is a crystal resting on a colored surface, right? So the crystal is clear, it's not murky. The idea is that the colored surface is real, independent of perception. And through the process of refining our mind, samapati here, which is kind of similar to samadhi, it can be almost understood synonymously, is that you can actually perceive it the same way you can perceive your yard by looking out the window, right? You are actually seeing your yard, So that to me, I don't believe that Bryant cites that one in his realist argument. I think he starts the realist arguments at Sutra 222. But that also becomes an interesting point of realism in the sutra in itself, because I think it's a very positive assertion of your ability to apprehend reality. So we see that, yeah.
Can you run that by me again? So you have a piece of paper, and the paper's color is real, but then there's a crystal ball on top of that.
Okay, so what's the crystal? There's Bryant points out that there's like really two ways of understanding what the crystal is in this analogy, and it bounces back and forth. Chapter 4. The commentators tend to focus on it being the Pradusha itself, right? We like that because it's passive. It's not doing anything, right? Reality comes in front of it. You can see reality. It's aware, right? But then there's also the idea that once you purify your mind, the kshina, the attenuation of the chitta vrittis, once you've moved up in this direction, away from multiplicity, quantity, more to quality, right? As you get up there, your actual mind becomes pure. So this is also this idea that your Purusha is really the observer, and that the crystal itself is the purified chitta, the purified mind, okay? So that analogy gets worked both ways in the sutra by the commentators, right? I think you can think about it in both contexts, but I really like the crystal analogy better than some of the other ones, because for me, there's something very passive about the crystal that I think really speaks to how the Purusha should be understood, as opposed to some of these other understandings, like Bryant constantly is using the movie projector analogy, that the film is there, and the movie projector is shining light, illuminating the screen without itself being touched. The sun shines down on the earth, and look at all the things it creates, but it doesn't touch the earth. But to me, that's almost getting a little too active, because it's actually doing something. And I'm not quite sure if that really states the passive nature of the Purusha quite as well as this other analogy does. But then also we have to wonder how good any of these analogies are going to be.
I feel the projector is in line with your crystal ball thing, though.
Well,
you're
the
just putting
projector's
something in front of something else, which is changing the way that light is perceived. You know what I mean? Like the projector's not.
But it's active. It's doing
projecting
something. It's not like the crystal. The crystal analogy, the colored paper is there irrespective of whether the crystal is there or not. It's completely passive. It's completely not. But I guess there is the idea that the Purusha is, in a sense, impelling the Prakriti as well too. So. Anyway, these are just some of the analogies that get thrown around to understand this. Okay, so moving right along, I'm going to move into the Sutra 222, which is also. So what I'm basically doing is I've set up Burley's diachronic, phenomenological, idealist understanding of the sutra, right? And these, in particular, this he considers Prakriti to not be material, but he considers it to be the, quote, material of experience. He doesn't consider this to be manifest and unmanifest. What he considers this is manifest to your awareness. he doesn't consider stula and shukshma to be ontological in the sense that the normal way of interpreting this is that which is subtle causes that which, there's a causal relationship going down here, like much like we see here, this causes that, causes that.
In matters of experience.
Well, he interprets it in that way, and he
Not
also,
materially.
what you can experience.
Right.
From the perspective of that which is shukshma, you can perceive that which is stula. From that which is stula, you can't go back and look at that which is shukshma. So he sees it as perceptual, right? So basically, the farther back you go,
You're purifying your experience.
yeah,
basically.
yeah. You're purifying your experience to like just pure subjectivity. Subjectivity and nothing else, right? It's not I am thinking. It's not I am conscious. It's just simply I. That's all, right? So that's how he
Or
understands.
just consciousness, because I itself is another quantity you've added on to consciousness.
Yeah.
So you might want to say that I is really another stula,
Yeah.
or another shukshma.
Yeah, then you bring up an interesting point about quantity, actually. How many, is the quantity of subjectivity,
So within subjectivity, there can be quantities of different elements, which is what all that is about, right? Bifurcation of experience into I as the doer, and the I as the experiencer, and the experience seeing.
Exactly.
So you really want to be at a stage where just experiencing,
Yes.
not the I experiencing.
Not
because
I
then you end up
experiencing
getting,
that, yeah.
like Kant points out, you get a reflexive.
Yeah.
Consciousness has to jump back somewhere
Yeah.
to catch an eye,
Yeah. Well, at one point,
even if it's in an
Chaitanya,
empty space.
not Chaitanya, Vyasa makes a statement that even to say, and he says it in Sanskrit, I can't remember exactly, but he says something to the effect of Chaitanya consciousness as being the Svarupa of the Purusha is wrong because you can't use the genitive case for Purusha.
Right.
You can't say it possesses or does anything.
Right.
This is all coming out of Satkardyavada, right? The idea of Satkardyavada, again, is, I keep coming back to the sutra, part of Namaikatavat Vastu Tattvam, right? This ekatva, this oneness of everything. So everything is this kind of, it's a dualist school in that there's Prakriti and Purusha, but the material world is just a transformation of this one Prakriti. So everything here, while quantitatively there's diversity, qualitatively it is just simply Prakriti itself, right? So that's what it is. So
But
everything
that
is
too
just
is eliminated.
What's that?
Even Prakriti is eliminated at the point of Kaivalya.
Okay, it's eliminated relative to the individual Purusha. I'm going to get to the Sutra on 4 here in a second, but all right, but it's eliminated not for everybody, right? It's not a total cessation of Prakriti.
No, are you talking
It's
about,
just-
is this Burley or Bryant?
This is Bryant. And this is
Oh,
also the Yoga
Bryant.
Sutra.
Okay, sorry,
Yeah.
I should.
Yeah. Okay, so anyway, this is the basic idea of these two guys. Okay, so let me now that I've set up Burley's thesis, now I'm going to show several sutras that I strongly feel contradict that. And it's kind of a fun, creative process to try to think about, well, how would Burley interpret, like Professor Jesus did with Ishwara, like what would he do with that, So some of these it's a little easier, but it can get hard. Okay, so Bryant starts the discussion with 222, which is okay. So when the artha, the object karta, has been like accomplished in that's to say the object of Prakriti. Right? And what is the object of Prakriti? Prakasha kriya sthiti silam bhutendriyatmakam boga parva gartam darsham. Boga apavarga. Right? The object, the purpose of Purusha of Prakriti is to provide the Purusha with experience and liberation. Boga apavarga. That's the whole reason why it's there. Right? It's an interesting.
Boga Apavarga.
Yeah, apavarga.
Wow.
Yes.
But Boga is to eat.
Yes. Boga often gets interpreted as experience as well too. Bhuj, to eat, to enjoy. It gets used in a lot of different ways.
To enjoy, maybe.
To enjoy.
To enjoy the state of being in state of Purusha.
Yeah, but it also gets interpreted as in this experiencing sort of way as well too, and that's how I believe Bryant does.
Let's have that again. The aim of Prakriti was to provide Bhoga Apavarga to Purusha.
Yes.
The enjoyment of liberation to Purusha.
The enjoyment of liberation, or
So
maybe
this is
enjoyment
interesting.
and
This is an
liberation.
interesting interpretation because
Here it goes.
because most of the time people see this as being a burden on Purusha, right? This is the burden on Purusha.
Oh, yes, 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 yes.
Here it's saying that Purusha provides for
Okay.
the experience
Okay.
of. That I thought was a
Well,
unique-
that elicits an even more interesting question, and that is Pradusha ever bound in the first place? Right? And that is kind of a question we're just going to have to leave hanging for the time being, because it doesn't make any sense. If Pradusha is simply completely different, then how could it have ever been bound in the first place? And then that creates even the bigger problem, and this is what the later commentaries and later traditions, including the Brahma Sutra, start to criticize the school for. Is it's like, well, then this entire liberation process was buddhi doing buddhi to buddhi, you know? It's like this whole thing had nothing to do with the Pradusha in the first place. And this is where Sankhya Yoga starts to fall apart with the criticism of the later Vedanta, right? So, away from Vedanta, way back earlier here, let me start going through this. So what I'm saying is the Kirta Artha, the purpose of the Dirtsyam. Dirtsyam is a kenning for Prakriti. So once the purpose of Prakriti has been complete, that is to provide experience and liberation, i.e. the Pradusha is now liberated, whether it was bound before, different question, is going towards destruction, there is still anashtam. Anashtam, non-destructive of others because it's of anya, because sadharana, it's common. It's common. So the idea is that if I attain liberation, it doesn't just suddenly destroy Prakriti for everyone, but that Prakriti keeps going, irrespective of whether I'm liberated or not. This sounds kind of like a realism, right? That it's happening for you, it's happening. It's like we all have this common Prakritic experience, and if I bail on the scene, it's still happening. You know, theoretically, we all leave. That actually becomes like a point that nobody wants to talk about. Over and over again, I think Vijnana Bhikshu says something in the 4th chapter about, you know, don't even talk about if everybody gets liberated. It's not possible. You know, it's like there's so many different jivas that there's just, it's not even going to happen. Forget it. Don't even. Oh, and he says something like, certain questions just aren't worth asking. You know, he kind of has this kind of like, you know, like, because I told you so, sort of like axiomatic thing that he does, okay? So this is a realist understanding of the sutra, and that is that the world is objectively and externally real, whether we perceive it or not. And this is in the early on in the 2nd chapter, okay? So moving ahead into 4th chapter, this is where the realism of Bryant and the commentators and everything gets much more forcefully asserted, and this is when I move away from Tom R and more towards Tom C. and this is the refutation of the Buddhist idealism. And as far as I can tell, the Buddhist idealism is actually defined by Bryant in a lot of these same sort of ways and understood by the commentators. I have to say that I haven't yet gone through and translated the commentators' work on this section. It's something that I want to do. So I'm actually kind of taking a lot of Bryant's word for things. Sometimes when I go and look into Sanskrit, I find things a little different than how, or at least I have a different take on things. So a lot of this is coming out of Bryant's understanding. Okay, so the first several sutras, 4.1 through 4.13, are all just basic karma theory, which in itself, and as I'm reading this stuff, I'm thinking, I suppose you could do this in just a purely phenomenological interpretation of your own experience and the fruition of your karmas and such like that. It gets a little bit harder when we start talking about birth, jati desha kala samayana vachanat sarva no, somewhere else. But we start talking about birth several times, rebirth. So how to understand that, again, to have fun with our exercise, how Burley would understand that, I'm not really sure. But certainly by the time we get to 4.14, a lot of his interpretation comes under question. The first one is in the Sutra part of Namaikatvat Vastu Tattvam, which I've already cited several times. That is the Vastus. Vastus is what we're going to go with here as being kind of like the big point of contention. This is objects. And then, of course, the issue is whether you can know them for what they really are, or whether we can only know our mental construct of them. And this is the issue. All right. In this particular sutra, they're referred to as tattva. And that's about as close to a Sanskrit word for real that I can get. Vastus are real, objects are real, even in their multiplicity, even as a multiple quantity. But they're real in the sense that they're parinama. They're a transformation. This is Satkaryavada again. This is a transformation of this ekatva, of this singularity that is prakriti, right? As it goes through this process, okay? So here we have a strong example of, like, literally the sutra says that Vastu's objects are real. Now, I suppose we could understand that as they are real to us or something like that, you know, in the other way.
That will not be sufficient to get realism out of it.
No, this is just the beginning. No, this is the very first sutra out of 10. So actually it's the third one I've cited, but out of the 10 that are in the 4th chapter that I'm looking at. So that one is not sufficient in itself. You know, just the term tattva is not enough, right? But then with the next sutra, let me see if I have a couple notes here on how this is understood. This is the part where Vijnana Bhikshu starts talking about the parinam ekatva, right? The parinama ekatva, the transformation of the singularity. And this is a part that got me stuck. Before I read Burley's thesis, I got hung up on this part. And that is that somehow sound, tanmatra, creates akasha, ether. Somehow touch creates earth. Right? You know, like when we think about perception, normally it's like earth was there and then I perceived it through touch. You don't really think like your sense of perception somehow created earth. There's a certain absurdity to understanding this diachronic, ontological, evolutionary process when you hit this tanmatras creating mahabhutas. That somehow sensory perceptions are creating the elements of reality. It's like you know, your sense of smell is creating atoms or something. Like, it's really bizarre. So this to me becomes an interesting problem. And it's one that I've grappled with, and honestly, reading Burley's thesis at this point in my life was like a breath of fresh air. Somebody who made it make sense. Okay. The way Vijnana Bhikshu does this is he describes these in a way that Bryant talks about his vibrational energies. Right? Okay, kind of new agey, I like it. But I kind of take Bryant to be something of a hippie. He seems like a cool guy. You know, his picture in his book, he's like got long hair and his shirt's all unbuttoned. But anyway, the vibrational energies, right? So the idea is not behind the tanmatras. It's not necessarily, so this may be a false equation that senses are tanmatras. And it might be that tanmatras are really the vibrational energies that then our senses pick up on, and then being more subtle are like the subtle things that impel the elements to happen. Okay, so this is how Vijnana Bhikshu explains this, and this is how Bryant explains this as well too. I still have a hard time with that, but whatever. You know, this is just how these two guys understand. Okay, so that's it. So ahamkara creates the sound tanmatra, which creates akasha. You know, this is how this process is supposedly happening, and this becomes the avyakta, divyakta, this kind of creative process as well too. All right. So now Vyasa, in the commentary on this sutra, now gives us the Buddhist Purvapaksha. Okay, and these are just some of the ways that he describes Buddhist idealism. There's two things I really want to get done. I got 10 sutras, and there's no way I'm going to get through them. But the two things I do want to get down is how they present the idealists, and then how they refute it with their realism. That's actually really cool. And I suspect that some of these same arguments have happened in the Western discourse as well too. So here's just some quotes on how Vyasa, according to Bryant's translations again, presents it. The idealist Purvapaksha, there is no physical object external to or independent of thought. That sounds like process philosophy, right? An object demonstrably exists only if it's cognized by thought, kind of like phenomenology, right? Objects that appear to be independent of thoughts in reality are demonstrably internal to it, such as the objects imagined in dreams. So this is a dream analogy that really, this is the same as the dream, right? Nothing can be known independent of thought. Some so-called external objects, such as those perceived in dreams, are in fact not external at all. So that gives you the question of what is this field of consciousness that we're talking about? You know, is it, these things are actually happening, and it's hard to say. External objects are just constructions of the mind. Okay, so this is just basic. You never actually perceive reality. All you ever perceive is your mental construct of reality. You're basically trying to create the most perfect model that you can of reality. It's like, you know, I imagine like somebody creating like a model of the Vatican City or something, and like, you know, trying to get better and better and better and better and better in detail, and then sitting down at the model and being like, now I'm in Vatican City. You know, so no matter how good you do, you never actually really get it. So that's kind of the idea here, okay? All right, so as Professor G has pointed out, this sutra alone is not enough to establish any sort of realism. If that's not, maybe 413 will be Vastu samye chittaveda tayor vibhakta pantaha, right? Vastu samye, right? The objects are the same. Chittaveda, it's the minds that are different, right? So we're all looking at the same cup. Right? Everybody says the vastu is the same. It's just the chittas that are, you know, I'm thinking, I'm thirsty.
The perceptions are different.
Yeah, exactly. Vastu samye chittaveda tayor vibhakta pantaha. It's just that the...
Chitta Veda?
Yeah, chitta Veda, right? Like this loaded Vedantic
Not Chit
term.
Veda, Chitta Veda, which
Chitta
means
Veda.
perception.
Yeah, chitta Veda. Chitta Veda, not long A, but chitta Veda, not chitti Veda, right? The chitta is Veda, right? So we have the separate minds. The object is the same, irrespective of which chitta is looking at it. It's just vibhakti pantaha, right? It's just that the object is different path,
right.
is on a separate path.
The perspectives are different. The consciousness, chit could still be one. In other words, we could all be of one consciousness,
Yeah.
but our perceptions are separate.
Yeah, there's a certain ambiguity in
No,
there.
it's pretty clear to me that it's chitta, it's not chit Veda. So chitta, chitta like memory, chitta like any cognition. So the cognitions are different, but the objects are the same. And you can just leave it at that.
Yeah.
You don't have to worry about saying that the consciousness are different.
Well, I'm explaining the vibhakta panta set part.
The manas is different in each one, but it doesn't need to be.
What I'm saying is ambiguous, is it's not entirely clear whether vibhakta panta is the Veda chittas, or whether it's the difference between vastus and chittas.
Okay.
Right? So maybe vibhakta panta is vastu, and the vibhakta panta is now chitta. They're both on vibhakta panta. They're two different paths.
How do you translate Vibhakta Panta?
Vibhakta is like a different
Yeah.
path, just a different place or something like
Right.
that, or a different, you know, this panta is, you know, it's just such a, that in itself is a very loaded, rich term
I see.
as well too, you
You're
know.
using two terms there, right?
Yeah.
Okay, well, let's agree.
So anyway, this is pretty clear. I mean, it seems like the vastu is samye. It's sama. It's the same for everyone, right?
But it's not an answer to idealism. I mean, it seems to be saying something else completely from what the previous stand. It doesn't really, you can still have the same object, even though we have different minds and so on. But it's only same because it's called intersubjectivity. We will agree to saying that, okay, well, all our minds collectively project one object.
Yeah, they address this, and they consider that, I think, Yogacara, right? So they address that in a second.
Right.
Yeah.
So this is relying
Actually,
on other
sutra
minds. Like other minds are perceiving the same thing, and that's what makes the object real. Do they talk about why we even believe other minds?
Yeah. Okay, so the realist proofs. Okay, this is the thing that I really wanted to get to here. Okay, so I'm just going to read through some of the bullet points here. So if the same objects produces different feelings in different minds, then the actual vastu, being common to all, must be different than the mind, right? That is, if the object was just a mental construction, then why is it that we all see the same object? And we may see it differently, we may perceive it differently, but it's basically the same object. And the story they tell is these like 4 brothers who come across a woman, and they all have a very different, one loves her, one hates her, one thinks she's ugly, one thinks she's beautiful. And the question is, she's just a mental
There
construct.
were 5 brothers in Mahabharata, but anyway.
Yeah, as the Mahabharata, Chaitra, and these other guys. But anyway, but the argument is that yes, even though they all have their own mental construct on how to interpret that woman, the woman is there nonetheless.
Nobody is there.
Yeah, there's still an object that's there, right? The difference would be just differences in responses, in a different perception, but not necessarily a difference in the nature of the object. So they're all perceiving the same woman. So if the idealist argument was true, we would not all simultaneously. This is a temporal dimension to this as well, too. So if it is a construct of one, why are we all seeing it at the same time? So it's got to be there because we all are perceiving, maybe interpreting it differently, but we're all seeing something that we all kind of agree on to some extent, and it's all kind of at the same time, right? So all individual mental thought constructs would be shared if everyone perceived the same objects. So then the question then becomes well, why don't people share all the same thoughts? If there really was nothing there, and we all perceived it at the same time, and we all perceive something that's about the same sort of thing, then one could argue that maybe we're all imagining it at the same time. That would mean that we're all sharing our thoughts.
It's not necessarily imagining. Can't have this thing that there is a thing in itself, right?
Yeah.
Which we can never know, thing in itself.
Yeah.
But our mind is constructed in such a way that we have certain categories in our head. And these categories are universal in each one of us. And that by virtue of these categories, we see some things. So what's happened is, in some ways, there is, if you like, a projection. If not a projection, there might have been some other object altogether. It might have been a box. But the way that we're set up, and it has to do with lighting and so on and so forth, we are all going to see a tree.
Because we all share this
Right.
meme-like category.
And there is no tree.
Yeah.
Right? So that's the answer
Yeah.
to that one.
Yeah.
There's more sophisticated forms of idealism than people realize. That doesn't have to be, you can't say, because we see the tree, that necessarily there has to be the tree. There's mass hallucinations as well. I mean, all the Nazis were having hallucinations about Jews, and right now we're having all hallucinations about Muslims. We should say. So, anyway.
Yeah.
But this is
Okay,
very,
so here's some more arguments they try to refute with this, okay? If one accepts the common experience of the external object can spontaneously occur, as in internal mental constructs of numerous people, what is the original cause of it? So then the question becomes that of causation, right? So if we are all mass hallucinating, which one of you guys started it? Where did it come from? It must have some sort of external locus, right? Whose mind originally imagined all the varied perceptions. One person doesn't share the dream of another. So why is it that we're sharing, it's like I had a great dream last night, you guys didn't share in that perception. I have my own personal thoughts, you guys don't share in that perception. So why is it that this kind of perception we would all be sharing, right? Why doesn't everybody have identical impressions all the time? So it doesn't really explain away the nuanced perceptions. So this is Vyasa's conclusion on this. There must be a distinction between the object of perception and the instrument of perception. So this is, again, one of the places where I get really frustrated, because the common cliche in pop spirituality is, being one of subject and object. But yoga is clearly about dividing the subject and the object, and knower from the known, and realizing that separation, all right? I got about 8 more sutras. They keep going in that sort of direction, but I did.
I think we got the.
I did get the general gist.
We got the general gist. This is your work on that. I mean, he's writing a whole book on this. That's fantastic. The Kaivalya Pada. But I shared with you the recent paper that Jerry Larson, your hero, gave, and he said he's translated.
You're my hero. I just said he was the legend.
He's the legend. Okay. He's translated a fresh translation of the fourth father, and also with the sutra, with the commentaries as well. But he's using a very different edition of it.
His criticism is that everybody's been using the wrong
critical.
word.
Yeah, you read it.
Yeah, I did. I would do anything.
It'd be interesting to look at that.
I would really like to get my hands on that translation. It's not published yet?
Not published yet, yes.
Because, you know, I'm writing about it and like, I mean,
The last one he mentioned, you know, in the context of the diagram.
I don't want to reinvent the wheel here, you know.
I still feel like all of this is dependent on other minds being in existence. You know what I mean? Like, so if you're part of your idealism is that you're just projecting, oh, Tom's seeing it too, and so is
Right.
other Tom, but they're just ideas in my head,
Right.
then you're still at ground zero. You know what I mean? Like, you haven't moved anywhere. Because it's still all
I'm not real.
Yeah, I know, that's exactly.
Nobody ever accused Tom
Tom
of being
keeps
real.
talking about how but like, if this is based on communal, and communal doesn't exist, then.
Yeah, right, yeah. Mm.
I mean, you're talking about from the idealistic standpoint.
Yeah, from the idealistic standpoint.
Well, why can't one mind sort of break up into, you know, different minds and then do this?
Well, isn't that,
I would argue
that's
still
how
your
Burley would
mind,
do it, right?
You know, that would still be your mind. You're just perceiving that you're now other mind, unless you're
Yeah,
talking
yeah.
about an actual break in your mind.
Well, if everything is actually ekatva,
In time, break up in time. So it seems to, it appears that it's spatially separate, but in fact, it's just a different moment at which it's reacting. So the same mind, it's bopping here and then bopping there and then bopping there. And then each one is doing a job and think that each one is perceiving an object. And because there are 3-4 perceptions of the same thing, it's saying that it must exist independently, otherwise we wouldn't be saying the same thing. But in fact, when you think about it, it's one mind doing this projection at different points, right?
well, Prakriti is ekatva, right? It is singular in a sense.
It is, yeah, but in this case, there is, in idealism, Prakriti is nothing other than what's
Your
being
experience.
projected out from it. So you don't have to assume other minds. It's the same mind that is being the other mind,
I see what
being
you're
the other
saying.
mind, being the
That's
other
kind of a
mind,
cool
and each
concept,
one
yeah.
is doing the other of the opposite.
Right.
Can I just mention that Dikshanika Vada is taken on pretty forcefully here as well too,
Right.
and they're accused of
The momentary mind.
Yeah, Ati Pratsanga, the infinite regress, is the argument that they use against that. That gets really interesting in front of the well too. So anyway.
Well, thank you very much. That was